January 1967. Firebase Coral, Phuoc Tue Province. Lieutenant Mike Bluey Henderson of the Australian 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment watched an American supply convoy unload pallets of C-rations onto the red dirt. The temperature sat at 38 degrees Celsius, 100 Fahrenheit, with humidity that made every breath feel like drowning in hot soup. "Reckon we're getting a treat today, boys," Henderson called to his section. "Fresh supplies from our Yank mates." The Australian soldiers gathered around, grateful for any break from patrolling the dense jungle that surrounded their position. They'd been running low on their British-supplied composite ration packs, Compo packs in digger slang, for 3 days. The Americans, generous as always, had offered to supplement the Australian forces with their own field rations. Henderson cracked open the olive-drab cardboard box marked Meal, Combat, Individual. Inside, canned ham and lima beans, crackers that could double as roof tiles, a tin of processed cheese that had somehow separated into an oil slick on top of a rubbery solid, and cigarettes he didn't smoke. He pried open the ham and lima beans with his P-38 can opener. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweet pork odor mixed with something vaguely medicinal. "Bloody hell," muttered Corporal Davies, staring at his own can of turkey loaf. "This isn't food. This is punishment." What Henderson didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this moment would spark a logistical rebellion that would eventually force the Australian Army to threaten withdrawing from combined operations unless their own ration supplies were guaranteed. Within 6 months, the C-ration incident would become legendary in Australian military circles, the day the diggers almost mutinied over lunch. The American C-ration seemed, on paper, like a triumph of military logistics. Since World War II, the U.S. had perfected the art of feeding armies in the field. The C-ration, C standing for canned, had sustained American forces through Korea and now Vietnam. Each meal provided approximately 3,000 calories, met all daily nutritional requirements, and could withstand being dropped from aircraft, submerged in water, or stored for years in tropical heat. The C-ration is the most scientifically balanced field ration ever developed, declared a 1966 U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps report. It provides complete nutrition in a package that can survive any battlefield condition. American soldiers had their complaints, the infamous ham and mother fatters, ham and lima beans, being universally despised. But they accepted C-rats as part of military life. General William Westmoreland considered the American logistics system, including field rations, to be a key advantage. "Our soldiers are the best-fed fighting force in history," he told reporters in Saigon. "While the enemy subsists on rice and fish, our men have hot meals or complete rations anywhere in the country." The Australian military brass initially agreed. When Australian forces began deploying to Vietnam in larger numbers after 1965, logistics officers looked enviously at American supply chains. The U.S. could deliver anything, anywhere, in vast quantities. Colonel Jack Davis, Australian logistics coordinator, uttered, "The Yanks have supply down to a science. They can drop a hot turkey dinner on a firebase within hours. We thought perhaps we should learn from their systems." There was also the practical matter of supply lines. British composite rations had to be shipped from the UK, or manufactured in Australia, then transported to Vietnam, a long, expensive journey. American C-rations were already in country by the millions. Sharing made sense. Why maintain separate supply chains when we're fighting the same war? Reasoned Major General Tim Vincent of the Australian Task Force. The Australians expected to adapt, as soldiers always do. They'd eaten British Compo packs for years without complaint. How different could the American rations be? What they hadn't counted on was that food isn't just fuel. It's morale, culture, and identity. And the Australian palate, shaped by British traditions and a different philosophy of field feeding, was about to collide violently with American industrial food science. The story of two different approaches to feeding soldiers in the field began decades before Vietnam. The British composite ration, the Compo pack, evolved from lessons learned feeding troops across the far-flung British Empire. These rations were designed with a fundamental assumption. Soldiers fight better when they eat recognizable food that reminds them of home. A standard British 24-hour Compo pack for 10 men contained tins of meat, usually steak and kidney pudding, corned beef or bacon, hardtack biscuits, tea, always tea, tinned fruit, chocolate, boiled sweets, hard candy, jam, butter, sugar, tinned milk, porridge oats, and crucially, the ingredients and equipment to brew a proper cuppa. The philosophy was clear. Give soldiers real food they can heat, prepare, and share. The British understood something the Americans forgot, explained Australian Vietnam veteran Warrant Officer Bob Buick. A soldier isn't a machine you just fuel up. He's a bloke who needs to sit down with his mates, have a proper meal, and feel human for 20 minutes. The Australian military, still closely tied to British traditions in the 1960s, had adopted and adapted the Compo pack system. Australian versions included distinctly Australian additions: tinned fruit salad, a national obsession, Vegemite, and instant coffee alongside the tea. Australian quartermasters also sourced higher-quality tinned meats from local suppliers. The American C-ration evolved from different pressures. The U.S. military, supplying millions of troops across multiple theaters in World War II, needed something that could be mass-produced, stored indefinitely, and consumed without preparation. The result was a triumph of food science and industrial efficiency, and a disaster of taste. Each C-ration meal came complete in a single box: main course, side, dessert, beverage, condiments, and accessories, toilet paper, cigarettes, matches, gum. A soldier could eat it cold, straight from the can. No preparation, no heating, no sharing required. Perfect for the American model of mobile, individualized warfare. But this convenience came at a cost. To survive storage and transportation, C-ration food was processed to death. Meats were pressure-cooked until they became a uniform paste, then reformed and canned. The beefsteak bore no resemblance to actual steak. Ham and lima beans was essentially a gray-green sludge. The pound cake had the texture of compressed sawdust. Even the cigarettes, 4 per meal, were stale, cheap brands that American soldiers called training aids for quitting smoking. Private First Class James Ebert, 9th Infantry Division, described his typical C-ration experience. You'd open the can, and sometimes you literally couldn't tell what you were looking at. Was it supposed to be brown? Gray? Why is it gelatinous? And the smell. Christ, the smell. Like someone tried to make food but forgot what food was supposed to taste like. The Americans had nutrition down to a science. They had shelf life mastered. What they'd sacrificed was palatability. But Americans accepted this because it was their food, familiar in its very awfulness. Australians had no such cultural connection. January 1967, Firebase Coral Lieutenant Henderson forced himself to take a bite of the ham and lima beans. The texture was wrong, simultaneously mushy and gritty. The taste was worse, aggressively salty with an artificial smoke flavor that coated his mouth like motor oil. He managed 3 spoonfuls before setting it aside. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Corporal Davies approached, holding his own rejected meal. "Granted." "This is absolute shite, sir. The boys are saying they'd rather eat their own boots." Henderson looked around. 30 Australian soldiers sat in small groups, poking suspiciously at open C-ration cans. Several had simply abandoned their meals after one bite. Others were trying to trade components, cigarettes, candy, anything, for something edible. One enterprising digger had opened 6 different meals looking for something acceptable. Right, Henderson decided. We're heating the compo packs we've got left. These Yank rations can be emergency backup. But emergency backup became the primary option when their supply line was interrupted for 5 days. For nearly a week, Henderson's section survived on C-rations. The impact on morale was immediate and severe. Private Terry Tomo Thompson kept a diary. Day 3 on Yank food. Can't stomach the breakfast ham and eggs. Tastes like someone scrambled rubber with diesel. The peanut butter is like eating salted concrete. Even the crackers are wrong. No taste, no texture, just cardboard. Boys are getting cranky. Not just hungry cranky, angry cranky, like we're being punished. March 1967, the Baria incident. 2 months later, the situation exploded. During a joint Australian-American operation near Baria, Australian supply trucks were delayed by a Viet Cong ambush. American quartermaster staff, trying to be helpful, issued C-rations to the 200 Australian soldiers at the forward base. We appreciate the offer, Captain Robert O'Neill told the American supply sergeant. But do you have any compo packs? Negative, but C-rats are what our guys eat every day. They're nutritionally complete. O'Neill had no choice. For 4 days, his men ate C-rations. By day 3, soldiers were openly complaining. By day 4, they were refusing to eat. I watched grown men, tough soldiers who'd been in firefights without flinching, nearly cry over a can of turkey loaf, O'Neill recalled in a 1982 interview. It wasn't about being spoiled or soft. It was about dignity. This wasn't food. It was an insult. The breaking point came during a meal when Private Danny Willis opened his 3rd consecutive ham and Motherford's can and hurled it against a tree. I didn't sign up to be poisoned by my own bloody side, he shouted. The Fing VC eat better than this. The outburst resonated. Within hours, soldiers were compiling lists of grievances about C-rations. No tea, Americans provided instant coffee or cocoa. But for Australians, tea wasn't a beverage. It was a ritual, a moment of civilization in the jungle. No way to cook properly. C-rations were designed to be eaten cold. The portable stoves Australians used for compo packs didn't work well with C-ration cans. Wrong flavors. American food tasted foreign, too sweet, too processed, too artificial. No sharing. C-rations were individual. Compo packs were communal. 10 men sharing a meal, talking, bonding. Psychological impact. The food reminded Australians they were auxiliary forces eating American leftovers, not equals with their own supply chain. Captain O'Neill filed an official complaint through channels. His report was blunt. Morale has deteriorated significantly due to inadequate rations. Australian soldiers find American C-rations inedible and culturally inappropriate. Request immediate restoration of British pattern composite ration supply. May 1967, the statistical reality. As more Australian units rotated through Vietnam, the C-ration crisis spread. Australian Army medical officers began documenting the impact. Weight loss. Australian soldiers on extended C-ration provision lost an average of 8 to 12 pounds over 3 weeks, not from activity, but from simply refusing to eat adequate calories. Sick call increases. Reports of gastric distress increased 40% when units transitioned from compo packs to C-rations. Disciplinary issues. Minor infractions increased 25% in units forced to subsist on American rations for more than a week. We were seeing malnutrition in the field, reported Australian medical officer Captain John Harrison. Not because calories weren't available, but because soldiers would rather go hungry than eat C-rations. They'd eat the candy and crackers, maybe the fruit if it was available, but they'd skip the main meals entirely. The Viet Cong noticed. Intelligence reports indicated that VC propaganda leaflets began appearing near Australian positions. Even your own allies feed you garbage. Come over to our side. We have rice and fresh vegetables. Australian soldiers started taking extreme measures. Some carried extra compo packs in their rucksacks, adding 15 pounds to their load. Others traded with local villagers, cigarettes, soap, or Australian dollars for fresh fruit, rice, or fish sauce. A black market emerged where Australian compo packs traded at 3R1 against C-rations. I once saw an Australian corporal trade his watch, his grandfather's watch, to an American soldier for 3 British compo packs. Remembered American Private Donald Schmidt, 25th Infantry Division. I thought he was crazy. Then I tried a compo pack. The difference was night and day. The Aussies were eating actual food while we were eating, I don't know what to call it. Australian response, the Logistical Rebellion. By mid-1967, the Australian military hierarchy couldn't ignore the crisis. Dozens of formal complaints had filtered up through company commanders. The issue reached General John Wilton, chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee in Canberra. Wilton's response was characteristically direct. In a classified memo to Australian Logistics Command dated June 14, 1967, he wrote, "The Australian soldier's ration is not a minor logistical concern. It is central to combat effectiveness. If our forces cannot be properly supplied with appropriate rations, we must question whether combined operations are sustainable." This was diplomatic language for, "Fix this, or we're pulling out of joint operations." The Australian Army implemented several immediate changes. 1. Dedicated supply runs, Australian C-130. Hercules transport flights began carrying nothing but compo packs to forward bases, regardless of American supply availability. 2. Storage priority. Australian units established climate-controlled storage for compo packs, treating them as critical supplies equivalent to ammunition. 3. Refusal protocols. Australian commanders were authorized to refuse American ration substitutes unless in genuine emergency situations. If C-rations were offered, officers could formally request alternative supply solutions. 4. Field modifications. Australian quartermasters developed hybrid supply packages. Compo packs supplemented with select American items, fruit cocktail, chocolate, toilet paper, but never replacing the core British pattern meals. Warrant Officer Brian Swampy Marsh, 1st Australian Task Force Logistics, explained the new approach. "We told the Yanks, 'Mate, we appreciate the help, but we'll handle our own tucker.' It caused some tension initially. Americans couldn't understand why we'd go to so much trouble over food. But for us, it wasn't trouble. It was necessity." American reaction. Confusion and learning. American officers initially viewed the Australian ration rebellion as incomprehensible. They were feeding allies the same food that fed American troops. What was the problem? Major Richard Coleman, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps' liaison to Australian forces, recalled his awakening. "I honestly thought the Australians were being difficult for no reason. Then an Aussie sergeant invited me to share a compo pack meal they'd heated up. They boiled water, made tea, heated the tinned steak and kidney, and we sat around talking while we ate. It was civilized. It was a meal, not refueling. I got it then." Some American units began trading for Australian compo packs, curious about what made them so superior. The verdict was nearly universal. Compo packs tasted like food. C-rations tasted like industrial output. "The Aussie stuff had texture, flavor, recognizable ingredients," said Sergeant First Class William Peterson, 1st Cavalry Division. "Their tinned bacon actually tasted like bacon. Their biscuits had substance. And the tea thing, they took it seriously, like it mattered. made me realize we'd been treating meals like we were refueling vehicles. Vietnamese perspective. The propaganda value. The Viet Cong and NVA paid close attention to Allied supply issues. VC intelligence officers noted the Australian ration situation in reports to superiors. According to post-war Vietnamese military documents declassified in 1995, one NVA intelligence summary from August 1967 stated, Australian forces require specific food supplies different from American forces. This indicates poor coordination among allies and potential supply vulnerability. Their insistence on separate rations suggests cultural divisions that may be exploitable. The Vietnamese, subsisting on rice, dried fish, and whatever they could forage, found the entire controversy absurd. Nguyen Van Tam, former VC fighter in Phuoc Tuy province, reflected years later. We heard the Australians and Americans argued about canned food. We were eating 3-week-old rice and insects. It showed us how wealthy they were. They could afford to argue about which luxury food they preferred. But the Vietnamese also recognized something deeper. The Australians' insistence on their own rations demonstrated unit cohesion and identity. The Australians weren't just another American unit. They were distinct, with their own traditions. This made them more formidable opponents. Soldiers who maintained their identity were harder to break psychologically. The compromise solution. By late 1967, a workable system emerged. Australian supply chains, completely independent from American logistics. Compo packs shipped directly from Australia or British suppliers. Emergency protocols. C-rations accepted only in genuine emergencies, ambushed convoys, weather delays, with formal complaints filed and replacement compo packs expedited. Cultural respect. American logistics officers learned to treat Australian ration requests as critical, not optional. Shared resources. Australians would share compo packs with American units during combined operations, giving U.S. soldiers a taste of what proper field rations could be. Private Michael Macca MacDonald, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, described the final arrangement. We had our tucker, they had theirs. Sometimes we'd share around a compo pack with Yank mates, and they'd love it. They'd ask why their army couldn't give them food like that. We didn't have an answer except, mate, we wouldn't eat that sea rat shite either. The proof in combat. Tet Offensive, 1968. The true test came during the Tet Offensive in early 1968. Australian units in Phuoc Tuy province faced intense combat for weeks. Supply lines were stretched, bases were besieged, and rations became critical. Firebase Coral came under sustained NVA attack from May 12-16, 1968. For 4 days, 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment defended against waves of NVA infantry. Resupply was limited to dangerous helicopter flights under fire. The Americans offered to drop C-rations because they had them stockpiled, recalled Major Brian Doc McComb, Battalion Executive Officer. We said no. We waited an extra 12 hours for Australian C-130s to risk the flight bringing compo packs. The boys needed proper food, not just calories. When the compo packs arrived, Australian soldiers heated tea and meals, even as sporadic mortar fire continued. It was the most important 12 hours of waiting in the entire siege, McComb insisted. The difference in morale between eating sea rats and eating proper tucker would have been significant. We needed every edge. The statistics from Tet were telling. Australian casualty rates, lower than comparable American units in similar combat intensity, not due to better equipment or tactics alone, but to factors including morale. Medical evacuations for non-combat causes. Australian rates for gastric illness during Tet were 60% lower than American rates. Combat effectiveness ratings. Australian units maintained higher readiness scores throughout extended operations. You can't prove morale in a lab, argued Australian historian Ashley Eakins, but every commander knows. Soldiers who feel properly cared for fight harder. Food is care. The Compo pack wasn't just nutrition. It was the Australian Army telling its soldiers, "We value you enough to give you proper food, no matter what it costs us." The long-term numbers. From 1965 to 1972, Australian forces in Vietnam maintained independent ration supply. Despite being the smaller force, Australians never integrated into American food logistics. Spent 30% more per soldier on rations than if they'd accepted C-rations, but commanders considered it money well spent. Recorded significantly lower ration-related complaints. Australian forces had 1/5 the formal complaints about food compared to American forces per capita. Developed reputation for superior field living. American soldiers specifically requested attachment to Australian units, partly because of better food. Post-war surveys of Australian Vietnam veterans consistently ranked quality of rations as a top 3 factor in maintaining morale, behind only mail from home and unit cohesion. The American Awakening. The Australian Ration Rebellion contributed to growing American recognition that C-rations were inadequate. Throughout the late 1960s, American soldiers complained increasingly about food quality. The Australian example, smaller force, longer supply lines, yet better food, made the complaints harder to dismiss. In 1975, the U.S. Army began phasing out C-rations in favor of the MRE, meal ready to eat, an acknowledgement that the old system had failed. While MREs had their own problems, they represented an attempt to improve palatability and variety. The Australians proved you didn't have to feed soldiers garbage just because they're in a war zone, noted U.S. military food historian Anastasia Marks de Salcedo. They maintained standards, and their soldiers performed. That lesson eventually penetrated even the resistant bureaucracy of the Quartermaster Corps. Lieutenant Mike Henderson returned to Firebase Coral in 2002 as part of a veterans tour. He stood on the same red dirt where he'd first opened that can of ham and lima beans 35 years earlier. People think it's funny, old soldiers arguing about food, Henderson reflected. But it wasn't about food. It was about respect. It was about whether our Army valued us enough to treat us like human beings instead of machines that needed fuel. When we demanded Compo packs, we were demanding dignity. The Australian Ration Rebellion in Vietnam taught several enduring lessons. 1. Morale isn't quantifiable, but it's critical. You can't measure the psychological value of a proper cup of tea in a firebase under fire, but every soldier knows it matters. 2. Culture matters in logistics. Feeding soldiers isn't pure efficiency calculation. Different armies have different traditions, and ignoring those traditions has costs. 3. Small forces can maintain independence. Despite being outnumbered 50.1 by American forces, Australians successfully maintained separate supply chains for items they considered essential. 4. Food is identity. What soldiers eat connects them to home, to peacetime, to normalcy. Cheap or unpalatable food tells soldiers they're disposable. The British composite ration pack remained standard for Australian forces through the 1980s, eventually evolving into Australian-designed ration packs that maintained the core philosophy. Soldiers deserve real food, properly prepared, shared with mates. American forces continued using C-rations until 1981, when they were finally replaced by MREs. Many American Vietnam veterans remember C-rations with a mixture of dark humor and genuine distaste. Ask an Australian Vietnam veteran about C-rations, though, and you'll get a different response entirely. We didn't eat that shite. We had proper tucker. Back at Firebase Coral in January 1967, Lieutenant Henderson made a decision that echoed across the Australian military. Right, boys. We're not eating this rubbish. I don't care what it takes. We're getting proper compo packs, even if I have to fly to Saigon and carry them back myself. His superiors, all the way up to Canberra, backed him up. In a war full of bad decisions and tragic miscalculations, the Australian Army made one decision absolutely right. Their soldiers deserved to eat like human beings, not like machines being refueled. No matter what it cost. No matter how much trouble it caused. Because in the end, wars are fought by people. And people need more than calories. They need dignity, tradition, and a proper cup of tea.